Don't be dramatic. Pack your bags and learn to survive. Vanessa said it before my son's body was even cold in the ground, before the funeral flowers had finished wilting on the dining table he built with his own hands. I said nothing. I simply nodded, because grief had taken my voice the way a thief takes what isn't his. 31 years I raised that boy alone after his father died, and 3 weeks later I was living out of a 2009 Toyota Corolla in a Walmart parking lot. But Vanessa didn't know about the clause. Nobody did. Not yet. My name doesn't matter yet. What matters is what I built and what I lost and what I was about to take back. I am 68 years old, and for 31 years I was the only parent my son Daniel ever truly had. His father, Robert, died of a heart attack when Daniel was 11, collapsed in our garage while changing the oil on a car he never finished fixing. I remember the silence after the ambulance left more than I remember the ambulance itself. That silence became the room I lived in for the next 3 decades. Not empty, not quiet exactly, but a silence shaped entirely around the work of raising a boy by myself on a school secretary's salary in a town outside Richmond, Virginia, where the winters were long and the heating bills longer. Robert had been a quiet man, an electrician by trade, who believed more in showing love through repaired fences and oiled hinges than in saying the word itself very often. I did not understand, in the early years of our marriage, that this was simply his language, not an absence of feeling, and it took me a long time after he died to recognize how thoroughly he had spoken that language to both Daniel and me without our ever quite noticing. The morning he died, he had left a note on the kitchen counter, written in his cramped, practical hand, reminding me that the gutters needed cleaning before the fall rains came. It was, in its own way, the last love letter he ever wrote me, and I have kept it in a drawer in my nightstand for 30 years, through every move, every hardship, every small reinvention of my life. I do not need to read it often. I simply need to know it is there. Gregory Pemberton, I should mention, did not come into Daniel's life by accident. Daniel had met him years earlier through the engineering firm, where Pemberton occasionally consulted on intellectual property matters related to patent licensing, and the two of them had struck up the kind of professional friendship that sometimes deepens, slowly, into something closer to trust. Pemberton told me once, during one of our later meetings, that Daniel had always struck him as unusually careful for a man his age. Not anxious, exactly, but deliberate. The kind of person who read every line of a contract twice and asked questions other clients never thought to ask. He told me once that he learned that from his mother, Pemberton said. He said you never let anything get past you when it mattered, and he wanted to be the same way. I had not known, until that moment, that the carefulness I had spent a lifetime practicing out of necessity had become, for my son, something he admired enough to imitate. I worked 2 jobs through most of Daniel's childhood. Mornings at the elementary school front desk, evenings cleaning offices downtown after the lawyers and accountants went home. I scrubbed floors that belonged to men who made more in a month than I made in a year, and I never once let Daniel see me tired. I packed his lunches in brown paper bags with little notes tucked inside, even when he was 16, and pretended to be embarrassed by them. I sat in the bleachers at every baseball game he ever played, even the ones where it rained so hard I had to wring out my coat in the parking lot afterward. When he wanted to go to engineering school and the financial aid wasn't enough, I sold my mother's wedding ring. The only piece of jewelry I owned that was worth anything. And I told him it had been lost in a move. I didn't want him carrying that weight. A mother's sacrifices, I have always believed, should be invisible to the child who benefits from them. That is not martyrdom. That is love with its sleeves rolled up. There is a particular winter I still think about more than any other, the year Daniel was 14 and our furnace broke in late January. I remember standing in the kitchen with the repair estimate in my hand, $600 we did not have, and deciding, without telling him, that we would heat the house with the oven door left open and 3 space heaters bought on layaway, and that I would take on a 3rd job, weekend shifts at a diner 2 towns over, rather than let him feel for one single day that we were poor. He never knew about the diner job. He thought I simply had errands on Saturday mornings. I came home smelling of bacon grease and exhaustion and made sure I had showered and changed before he saw me. Because I did not want my struggle written across my face the way it had been written across so many other mothers' faces in our neighborhood. Women whose children grew up believing that love and worry were the same expression worn permanently. I wanted Daniel to remember his childhood as warm. I wanted him to remember laughter at the dinner table, board games on Friday nights, a mother who always seemed, somehow, to have enough. The cost of that illusion was mine to carry alone, and I carried it gladly, the way you carry anything for someone you love more than your own comfort. I think, too, of the summer, Daniel turned 16 and desperately wanted a car, the way every 16-year-old boy in America desperately wants a car, and I told him, gently but firmly, that we simply could not afford one. He did not sulk. He did not demand. Instead, he got a job himself, bagging groceries after school, and saved every dollar for 8 months until he had enough for a battered, primer gray 1998 Civic that ran more on hope than on engine parts. I remember standing in our driveway the day he drove it home, watching him grin at me through the windshield with that same gap-toothed smile from his Little League photograph and feeling something close to pride so large it ached in my chest. That boy never once asked me for anything he hadn't already tried to earn himself first. That is the kind of son I raised. That is the kind of man Daniel became. And it is precisely why, when I sat in Gregory Pemberton's office and learned what he had quietly done to protect me, I was not entirely surprised. He had spent his whole life trying to earn his own way and protect the people he loved without making a show of it. The trust was simply the last and largest expression of a character he had been building since he was a boy bagging groceries for a primer gray Civic. Daniel grew into a good man. Quiet, steady, the kind of person who remembered your birthday and called just to ask how your knees were doing. He became a structural engineer, the kind who built bridges that other people's children would drive over for the next 100 years, and I was prouder of him than I have ever been of anything in my own life. When he met Vanessa at 28, I wanted to love her. I tried to love her. She was sharp and well-spoken and ambitious in a way that impressed people at dinner parties, the kind of woman who always knew which fork to use and which silence to fill with a compliment. For the first year, she called me Mom and brought me orchids on Mother's Day and seemed, in her clipped and careful way, fond of me. But love, real love, reveals itself over years, not dinners. And what I began to notice, slowly, the way you notice a draft in a house before you ever find the crack in the window frame, was that Vanessa's warmth toward me rose and fell with what I could offer. When Daniel got his promotion at the engineering firm and the money started coming in steadily, the orchids stopped. When I needed a ride to a doctor's appointment because my own car was in the shop, there was always a reason she couldn't. When I mentioned, just once, that my pension wasn't going to stretch as far as it used to with the cost of my blood pressure medication climbing every year, she changed the subject so fast it was like watching a door slam in a stiff wind. I remember asking myself, more than once during those years, whether I was being unfair to her in my own private accounting. Marriage is its own complicated arithmetic, and I knew better than most that a daughter-in-law owes her husband's mother nothing beyond basic courtesy, that love between in-laws is a gift rather than an obligation, freely given or not given at all. I tried, genuinely, to hold that standard for Vanessa, to release her from any expectation that she loved me the way a daughter might, to be satisfied with simple cordiality. But cordiality, I came to understand, requires consistency, and what Vanessa offered me was never consistent. It arrived only when there was an audience to perform for, or something to be gained from the performance, and it vanished completely the moment either condition was no longer met. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that not every woman is built for warmth toward her mother-in-law, that some people show love through structure instead of softness, that I was an old woman reading too much into silences. I have spent most of my life giving people the benefit of every doubt I had left in my pocket, even when the pocket was empty. The pattern, once I started seeing it, would not stop showing itself to me. It began with small things, the kind of small things that, on their own, mean nothing, but stacked together start to form a shape. Daniel began calling me less, not because he loved me less. I never doubted that, not for one single day, but because he admitted to me once over coffee, his hand wrapped tight around the mug like he was bracing for something. Vanessa says it's healthier if we have more boundaries with family. Boundaries. As though I were a hedge that needed trimming, rather than the woman who once stayed awake 3 nights in a row when he had pneumonia as a child, pressing cool washcloths to his forehead until the fever broke. Then there was the dinner, 18 months before Daniel died, when Vanessa mentioned. Casually, the way you mention the weather. that they were thinking about moving me into something more manageable once I got older. Not a nursing home, she clarified quickly, watching my face. Just somewhere with support. You understand. I understood that she had already pictured the day I would become an inconvenience, and that she had pictured it with more enthusiasm than grief. I noticed, too, the way she handled money around me. Daniel had always been generous. He sent me a little each month, never enough to make me dependent, just enough to make sure I never had to choose between my medication and my electric bill the way I had when he was small. But after he married Vanessa, those transfers came with notes attached. Last one for a while, Mom, things are tight. Things were never tight. I saw the renovations on their kitchen. I saw the new car in the driveway. I saw the Aspen ski trip on Vanessa's social media. 3 days after she told Daniel I should maybe wait on getting my hip looked at, since the copay was a lot right now. A mother notices these things even when she chooses, for the sake of peace, to say nothing about them. There was the time, 2 years before Daniel died, when I had a fall in my own kitchen and cracked 2 ribs, and Vanessa's response, relayed through Daniel because she did not call me herself, was to suggest I look into one of those medical alert necklaces rather than offer to come check on me. I lived alone in a small rental apartment by then, and I spent 4 days in considerable pain before a neighbor, not family, drove me to urgent care. Daniel came the moment he heard, white-faced with worry, and stayed the whole weekend nursing me back to steadiness. Vanessa sent a fruit basket. I remember staring at that basket of overpriced pears and thinking that it was, in its own small way, a perfect symbol of her, beautifully arranged, expensive, and entirely lacking in the one thing that actually mattered. There was also the Christmas, the last one Daniel was alive for, when Vanessa announced over dinner, in front of her own parents who were visiting from out of state, that she thought it was important for families to set healthy financial boundaries, and looked directly at me while she said it, though I had never once asked either of them for a dime that year. Daniel's jaw had tightened. He said nothing in front of his in-laws. The way a son raised to keep peace at any cost often says nothing, but he called me 2 days later, his voice low and apologetic, and said, "Mom, I'm sorry about that. She's just stressed about money lately, even though I keep telling her we're fine." I told him not to worry about it. I have spent my whole life telling people not to worry about me. It is, I have come to understand, both my greatest strength and the very thing that allowed so much of this to happen in the first place. The pattern sharpened in the final year of Daniel's life. He had started complaining of chest pains he dismissed as stress, the same kind of dismissiveness his father had carried right up until the morning he didn't wake up. I begged Daniel to see a cardiologist. Vanessa told him he was being dramatic, that stress was simply the cost of a high-performing career, that he should try yoga instead of turning every headache into a hospital visit. I have replayed that word, dramatic, more times than I can count, because it would come back to me, aimed at my own grief, only 3 weeks after the funeral. Daniel collapsed at his desk on a Tuesday in March. The doctors called it sudden cardiac arrest, the same silent thief that had taken his father, only this time it didn't even give us the mercy of a hospital bed and a goodbye. He was 43 years old. I buried my only child on a cold morning in April, and I stood at that graveside in a black coat that used to belong to my late husband, and I thought, in the strange, flat way grief organizes your thoughts, that I had now buried every man I ever loved in this life. I remember very little about the funeral itself with any real clarity. Grief has a way of blurring the edges of a day, even as it sharpens certain small details to an almost unbearable point. I remember the smell of the lilies, too sweet, the kind of smell I have not been able to tolerate since. I remember Daniel's college roommate, a heavy-set, kind-faced man named Marcus, gripping my hand at the reception line and saying, "Mrs. Whitfield, your son was the best of us. You should know that. He was the best of all of us." And I remember nodding because I could not yet trust my voice not to break entirely. I remember Vanessa standing beside me at the graveside in a beautifully tailored black dress, dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief, accepting condolences with the composed grace of a woman performing grief for an audience rather than living inside it. I did not judge her for that in the moment. Grief wears strange clothes on different people, and I told myself, generously, that perhaps this was simply how she carried it. What I remember most clearly, the detail that has never once blurred, no matter how many months have passed, is the drive home from the cemetery. Vanessa drove. I sat in the passenger seat of her car because mine had been left at the house, and for the entire 20-minute drive, she did not say one single word to me. Not about Daniel, not about the service, not about how I was holding up. She checked her phone twice at red lights. When we pulled into the driveway, she said only, "I have a lot to deal with the next few days. I'll be in touch." She was not, in fact, in touch. The next time she spoke to me at length was 3 days later, across that same dining table, sliding a folder toward herself with freshly manicured nails. The decision to act did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. It arrived the way water arrives in a basement, slowly, then all at once, until you are standing ankle deep and realize you should have noticed the seep in the wall weeks ago. It started with the will. 3 days after the funeral, Vanessa called a meeting at the house, my son's house, the one with the kitchen I had once helped pay the down payment on when they were young and struggling, and sat me down at the dining table with a folder of papers and an expression of practiced sympathy that did not reach her eyes. She explained, in the calm, rehearsed tone of a woman who had clearly prepared this speech in front of a mirror, that the house, the cars, the investment accounts, everything, really, had been left to her as Daniel's spouse, and that while she was so sorry for my loss, she felt it was healthiest for everyone if I found more independent living arrangements within the month. She used the word independent, the way some people use the word convenient, as a polite mask over a much uglier intention. I asked, quietly, what the will actually said. She told me I didn't need to worry about the details, that her lawyer had everything handled. I asked for a copy. She said she would get around to it. I knew, in that moment, the way you know a storm is coming before the sky has even darkened, that I was being managed rather than informed. I want to tell you about the exact moment I understood how thoroughly Vanessa had already planned this, because it is a detail that has stayed with me longer than almost any other. As she spoke at that dining table, sliding the folder toward herself rather than toward me, I noticed her nails, freshly manicured, a soft, deliberate shade of pink, the kind of manicure you schedule in advance rather than fit in spontaneously. My son had been dead for 3 days. I remember thinking, with a kind of distant, floating clarity that grief sometimes grants you, that a woman drowning in genuine sorrow does not generally find the time or the desire for a manicure appointment. It was a small thing. It was, I would come to learn, entirely consistent with everything that followed. Within the week, Vanessa changed the locks on the house. The house where I had spent every Thanksgiving for the last decade, where my late husband's tools still sat in the garage exactly where Daniel left them. She informed me, by text message, not phone call, that my things had been boxed up for storage and that I should make arrangements. I drove to that house with my heart pounding and found 3 cardboard boxes sitting on the front porch like garbage set out for collection. Inside one of them, wrapped carelessly in a kitchen towel, was a photograph of Daniel as a boy, missing his front teeth, grinning at the camera in his Little League uniform. She hadn't even bothered to put it in a frame box. She had simply thrown it in with the towels. I had nowhere to go. My small apartment from years ago had long since been given up when Daniel insisted, after Robert died and money was thin, that I move closer to him. I had no savings to speak of. What little I had, I'd spent helping pay for Daniel's wedding, an event Vanessa never once thanked me for funding the catering of. I called the only number I had left, that I trusted completely, not a family member, because in that moment, I no longer had any family left who wanted me, but Harold Ferris, the lawyer who had drawn up my late husband's estate documents 30 years earlier and who had, in all that time, never once stopped sending me a Christmas card. Harold answered on the second ring, the way he always does, as though he keeps the phone in his pocket specifically in case someone he cares about ever needs him at an odd hour. I told him, as steadily as I could manage, that I had nowhere to sleep that night. There was a pause on the line, brief but heavy, and then he said, in the gruff, no-nonsense voice I had known since I was 38 years old and bearing my husband, "Eleanor, you tell me where you are right now, and I will be there inside the hour, and we are not discussing pride, because pride doesn't keep an old woman warm in April." I told him I would rather sit with my thoughts that first night, that I needed to understand for myself what had just happened to me before I let anyone else carry it. He did not argue, though I could hear in his silence how much it cost him not to. He asked only that I call him every morning without fail, and that I let him send the $400 that arrived in my account before sunrise. A gift between old friends, he told me, when I tried to refuse it. Robert would skin me alive if I let his wife go hungry on my watch, and frankly, Eleanor, so would I. Harold had been a fixture at the edge of my life for 3 decades in the quiet, steady way that good men sometimes are. Never intrusive, never presumptuous, simply present whenever the ground gave way beneath me. He had handled Robert's modest estate without charging me a cent beyond what the state required, had shown up unannounced with a casserole the week after the funeral when Daniel was 11, and I did not yet know how to function in a kitchen built for 2. He had watched, from a respectful distance, as Daniel grew up, had attended his college graduation sitting 3 rows behind me because, he said, a boy should look out and see his mother's people there for him, even if some of those people are just old lawyers who liked his father. When I called him from that parking lot, he did not hesitate, did not lecture me about the choices that had led me there, did not ask why I hadn't called sooner. He simply showed up every single morning for a month, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with nothing but his presence in the seat beside mine, reminding me, without ever once saying it directly, that I was not as alone as Vanessa wanted me to believe. That night, with my 3 boxes in the trunk and the photograph of my grinning, gap-toothed son on the passenger seat beside me, I drove my Corolla into the parking lot of a Walmart on the edge of town, reclined the seat as far as it would go, and slept under a blanket I had bought from inside the store for $14.99, because it was the only blanket I owned anymore. I lived in that car for 1 month. I am not ashamed to tell you that. I want you to understand exactly what it costs a 68-year-old woman with arthritis in both knees to sleep folded into the front seat of a compact car in late April, when the nights still dip into the 40s and your body forgets, by morning, how to unbend itself. I want you to understand what it is to wash your face in a gas station bathroom, sink with paper towels, to ration the gas in your tank because gas is also heat, to eat crackers from a box because a hot meal costs money you don't have. I want you to understand what it is to grieve your only child while also fighting, every single day, simply to survive the day itself. But I want you to understand something else, too. I did not break. I had been underestimated my entire life. By teachers who assumed a secretary's son couldn't get into engineering school, by men at the office cleaning company who assumed an old woman with a mop couldn't read a financial statement, by Vanessa, who assumed that because I never raised my voice, I had nothing inside me capable of a fight. Every single person who has ever underestimated me has, eventually, discovered they were wrong. Vanessa was about to learn that lesson in the most expensive way of her entire life. It was on the 23rd day in that parking lot, while I was eating crackers and watching condensation fog the inside of my windshield, that my phone rang. The number wasn't saved, but I recognized the area code. Daniel's old office exchange. I answered, expecting a telemarketer, expecting anything but what I actually got. Mrs. Whitfield, the voice said, careful and formal. My name is Gregory Pemberton. I'm an attorney. I represented your son, Daniel, in a private capacity, separate from his family estate planning. I need to speak with you about a clause in a trust document he established 18 months ago. I believe it's extremely important that we talk as soon as possible. I want to tell you that I felt joy in that moment, but that would be a lie. What I felt was confusion, and underneath the confusion, a small flicker of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel since the funeral. Hope, thin and uncertain, like the first crack of light under a door that has been shut for a very long time. I agreed to meet him the next morning. I did not yet know that the meeting would change the entire shape of my life. I did not yet know that my son, in his quiet, careful way, had been protecting me long before Vanessa ever locked me out of that house. Harold Ferris met me outside Gregory Pemberton's office the following morning, not because I needed him there for legal reasons, but because I needed a familiar face beside me. Someone who had known Robert, who had known me before grief, reshaped everything about who I was. Harold had been the one I called the night I left that house with 3 boxes and a photograph. He had not let me drive away into nothing. He had wired me $400 from his own account that same night. Not a loan, he insisted. A gift between old friends. And he had spent every Sunday of that month calling to check that I was eating, that I was warm enough, that I hadn't given up. Harold Ferris is 74 years old and walks with a cane now, and he is, without exaggeration, one of the finest men I have ever known. He sat beside me in Gregory Pemberton's waiting room with his hat in his lap, the way men of his generation still do, and he said only one thing before we were called in. "Eleanor, whatever is behind that door, you face it like the woman who raised that boy alone. Spine straight. Spine straight." I have carried those 2 words with me every day since. Gregory Pemberton turned out to be a younger man than I expected, perhaps 40, with the careful, deliberate manner of someone who chooses every word the way a surgeon chooses an instrument. He sat across from us at a long mahogany table and slid a folder toward me with both hands, the gesture almost ceremonial. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "your son came to me 18 months ago. He told me, in his words, that he had a bad feeling about his health and an even worse feeling about how his wife might treat his mother if anything ever happened to him. He asked me to draft a trust completely separate from his primary estate, something his wife would have no visibility into, no claim over, and no ability to contest." I sat very still. Harold's hand found mine under the table. "Your son placed $10 million into an irrevocable trust in your name alone," Pemberton continued. "The funds came primarily from a patent he held jointly with his engineering firm, a structural reinforcement system used in seismic retrofitting, which the firm licensed for considerable sums over the past several years. He never told his wife about the patent royalties. He routed them, through me, directly into this trust, structured specifically so that they would never touch his marital estate and would never be subject to her claim, regardless of what happened to their marriage or his life." I asked him, my voice barely above a whisper, why? Why would my son hide $10 million from his own wife? Pemberton's expression softened, just slightly, the first crack in his professional composure. He told me something I've never forgotten, Mrs. Whitfield. He said, "My mother gave up everything for me and never once asked for anything back. If something happens to me, I need to know that no matter what my wife does, my mother will never spend another night wondering how she's going to eat." He made me promise that if he died, I would find you myself, track you down if I had to, and make sure you knew. He was worried, even then, that you might be too proud to come looking. I did not cry in that office, though I wanted to. I had cried enough in that parking lot for 10 lifetimes. What I felt instead was something steadier, something that settled into my chest like a keel settling a ship. The understanding that my son had seen Vanessa more clearly than any of us had given him credit for, that even as he loved her, some quiet, watchful part of him had been protecting me the entire time, long before he ever needed to. But understanding the money was only the beginning. I did not march out of that office ready to wave a check in Vanessa's face. I am 68 years old, and if there is one thing 31 years of motherhood and 3 weeks of sleeping in a Corolla taught me, it is that the people who hurt you the most don't deserve a quick reckoning. They deserve the slow, methodical kind. The kind that lets them dig their own hole a little deeper before you ever let them see the shovel in your hand. The plan took shape over the following 2 weeks, built carefully with Harold and Gregory Pemberton at that same mahogany table. The first stage was simple. I would say nothing. Vanessa believed I had nothing. No money, no leverage, nothing but a Corolla and a box of old photographs. And I intended to let her keep believing that for as long as it served me. I moved, with Harold's help, and using a small advance against the trust that Pemberton arranged within days, into a modest, furnished apartment on the other side of town, paid in cash, under a slight variation of my legal name that was still entirely truthful. My maiden name, Eleanor Hargrove, which I had not used since I married Robert 40 years earlier. It wasn't deception in any legal sense. It was simply a woman quietly stepping out of the shadow she'd been forced into, one she had no intention of stepping back into until she was ready. The second stage was information. Pemberton, through entirely legal means, requested a copy of Daniel's primary will and the estate filings now moving through probate, since I retained legal standing as Daniel's surviving parent to review certain disclosures. What came back confirmed what I had already suspected, but seeing it in writing still landed like a blow. Vanessa had filed for probate within 4 days of the funeral, an almost unseemly speed, and had already begun listing the house for a pre-market sale to a buyer she'd apparently been in contact with for months. The dates didn't make sense for a grieving widow moving at a normal pace. They made sense for a woman who had been planning an exit long before her husband ever stopped breathing. The third stage was patience, and patience, for me, was not difficult. I had spent 31 years learning how to wait. For a paycheck to stretch, for a son to come home safely from a school dance, for a winter to end. Waiting for Vanessa Whitfield to reveal the rest of herself was, by comparison, almost restful. There was a fourth stage, too, one I did not discuss, even with Harold at first, because I was not entirely certain I had the stomach for it. Diane, my new financial advisor, suggested quietly, almost as an aside during one of our early meetings, that if Vanessa was indeed undervaluing the house for a quick pre-market sale, there might be public county records, tax assessments, prior listing histories, permit filings for the renovations I had seen on her kitchen. That would establish, in black and white, exactly how far the filed valuation strayed from reality. I spent 2 afternoons at the county records office myself, in my plain gray coat, asking quiet questions of a clerk who had no idea she was helping an elderly widow build a case against her own daughter-in-law. I found what I needed within those 2 afternoons. A permit filed 8 months earlier for $42,000 in kitchen renovations, paid for, the contractor's invoice noted, in 2 installments from an account that did not belong to Daniel. I did not yet know whose account it was. I suspected, even then, that I would not like the answer when I found it. Pemberton, when I brought him the documents, studied them for a long moment before looking up at me with something close to admiration. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "most clients in your position want this resolved as quickly and loudly as possible. You're building a file. That's a different kind of patience entirely." I told him that loud resolutions are for people who haven't yet learned that the quiet kind lasts longer. It was Harold who suggested I attend Daniel's memorial gathering. The second, smaller one Vanessa had quietly scheduled at the house a month after the funeral, ostensibly for close friends and colleagues from the engineering firm, though I suspected its real purpose was to formally introduce herself as the grieving but composed young widow to people who mattered for her future, the kind of people who write recommendation letters and extend social invitations. I was not invited. Harold suggested I come anyway, quietly, through a side door, not to confront anyone, simply to listen. "People say true things at gatherings like this," he told me, "when they think the only person who might object is 6 feet under and can't hear them." Before that gathering, though, there was a smaller discovery, one that arrived almost by accident. Claire, Vanessa's sister, called me out of the blue one evening, ostensibly to ask how I was holding up, since she had not seen me since the funeral, and had apparently begun to wonder, in her own gentle way, why I had vanished so completely from the family's orbit. We spoke for nearly an hour, and somewhere in the middle of that conversation, Claire mentioned, entirely without guile, that Vanessa had been stressed about money, even with the house sale coming together, which struck me as strange, since I knew the house alone was worth more than enough to keep anyone comfortable for years. I asked, carefully, what she meant. Claire said only that Vanessa had mentioned some debts from before the wedding that needed clearing, debts she'd never discussed with Daniel. I did not press further. I simply filed the comment away the way you file away a loose thread, trusting that if you leave it alone long enough, it will eventually unravel the whole garment on its own. It was Harold who suggested I attend. He was right. I stood near the kitchen, out of the main flow of guests, wearing a plain gray dress that drew no attention, and I listened. I heard Vanessa, glass of white wine in hand, laughing softly with a colleague from Daniel's firm, telling her that honestly, the hardest part of this whole year wasn't even losing Daniel. It was dealing with his mother afterward. She just would not let go. Very needy, very dramatic. You know how some of these older women get when their only child passes? They latch onto anyone left standing. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me. I had not asked Vanessa for one single thing since the funeral. I had not called her, not texted her, not appeared at that house once since the day I found my belongings on the porch. The needy, dramatic, latching mother she described to her colleague was a fiction she had invented entirely, a story constructed in advance to explain away whatever cruelty she intended to commit next, and to make herself the victim of it before anyone could accuse her of being its author. I heard something worse, too. Later that evening, near the back patio where Vanessa had stepped outside with a man I did not recognize, introduced to other guests only as a friend from before. Their conversation was not one a widow has with a mere friend 4 weeks after burying her husband. I will not repeat every word of what I overheard, because some things, even in service of a story, do not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. What I will tell you is that the man's name was Trent, that he worked in commercial real estate, and that the two of them spoke with a familiarity, an ease, a shared history that had clearly existed long before Daniel's heart gave out at his desk on a Tuesday in March. I heard Vanessa say, low and laughing, "Once the house sells and the estate clears, we won't have to do any of this sneaking around anymore." I heard Trent say, "How much longer until probate closes?" And I heard Vanessa answer, without a flicker of grief in her voice, "Couple more weeks, then I'm free." I stood very still by that kitchen window for what felt like a long time after they went back inside. My hand pressed flat against the cool granite countertop Daniel had picked out himself 3 summers earlier, debating between 2 nearly identical shades of gray for an entire weekend because he wanted the kitchen to be exactly right for the woman he loved. I thought about how he had stood in that very spot, holding paint swatches up to the light, asking me which one I thought Vanessa would prefer, genuinely, earnestly wanting to make her happy in the smallest details of their shared life. I thought about how little she had deserved that kind of care, and how much of it she had received anyway, simply because my son was the kind of man who gave fully and assumed, generously, that the people he loved gave just as fully in return. I left the gathering shortly after, slipping back out through the same side door I had entered, careful not to be seen by anyone who might mention my presence to Vanessa before I was ready for her to know I had been there. Harold was waiting for me 2 blocks away, parked along the curb in his old sedan, the engine running for warmth. He took one look at my face when I got in and did not ask me to explain right away. He simply reached over, turned up the heat, and let me sit in silence for the length of 3 city blocks before he finally asked, gently, "Bad?" I told him everything I had heard, every word, as precisely as I could remember it, because I knew even then that precision would matter later, that the difference between a vague impression and an exact recollection might one day be the difference between suspicion and proof. Harold listened without interrupting, his hands steady on the wheel, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment before he said, "Eleanor, I have known you for 30 years, and I have never once seen you back down from anything worth fighting for. This is worth fighting for, not for revenge, for Daniel, for the truth he deserves, even now." I drove home that night with my hands steady on the wheel and my heart, for the first time since the funeral, entirely clear about what I needed to do. The counter move, when it came, was not loud. It did not need to be. I am not a woman who believes that justice requires shouting. I believe it requires documentation, patience, and the willingness to let a cruel person finish, revealing themselves completely before you act. Gregory Pemberton helped me file, quietly and well within my legal rights as Daniel's mother, a formal request for an accounting of the marital estate, given the unusual speed of the probate filing and certain irregularities Pemberton had identified in the asset valuations Vanessa's own attorney had submitted. Namely, that the house had been deliberately undervalued in the filing, likely to reduce the visible estate and, Pemberton suspected, to quietly funnel the difference to Vanessa through the pre-market sale to a buyer connected to Trent's real estate firm. This is not vengeance. This is the law, used exactly as it is meant to be used by someone who finally has the resources to use it. At the same time, and entirely separately, I secured my own position. With Harold's guidance, I had Pemberton finalize the full release of my trust. Not to spend lavishly, not yet, but to place myself beyond any further harm Vanessa could do to me. I purchased, in cash, a small but comfortable 2-bedroom house 11 minutes from Harold's, with a sunroom that catches the morning light the way my kitchen window used to when Daniel was small and would sit at the table doing his homework while I made dinner. I opened accounts. I hired, on Pemberton's recommendation, my own financial advisor, a steady, unhurried woman named Diane, who reminded me, in the best way, of myself 30 years younger. I did all of this without a single phone call to Vanessa, without a single word of explanation to anyone who didn't already know, because the woman who threw 3 cardboard boxes onto a porch did not deserve advance warning of anything I was about to do. Diane, in particular, became an unexpected anchor during those weeks. She did not treat me the way some financial professionals treat older women who suddenly find themselves with significant money. with a thin, condescending patience, as though wealth had arrived in my life by accident and needed to be managed on my behalf rather than by me. She sat with me for hours, explaining trust structures, tax implications, the difference between an irrevocable and revocable instrument, until I understood every single mechanism protecting what my son had built for me. "You don't need to take my word for any of this, Mrs. Whitfield," she told me during our first real meeting. "You need to understand it well enough that no one can ever talk you out of what's yours again." I have thought about that sentence as often as I have thought about Harold's comment about gardens needing a start. Between the two of them, I was being handed, piece by piece, the tools to never again be the woman who slept in a parking lot because she did not know what she was owed or how to claim it. I want to tell you that I felt vindictive during this stage, but the truth is more complicated than that, and I promised you the truth. What I felt was something closer to clarity. For 31 years, I had organized my entire life around the needs of other people. First Robert, then Daniel, then, in my own quiet way, even Vanessa, in the early years when I still believed she might come to love me the way a daughter loves a mother. For the first time since I was a young woman, I was making decisions based entirely on what I needed, what I deserved, and what would finally, after everything, set the scales back to level. I remember the first morning I woke up in my new house, in the small second bedroom I had set up as a sewing room. Something I had not allowed myself the luxury of since before Robert died, and lay in bed for a long moment, simply listening to the quiet, not the desperate, vigilant quiet of the Walmart parking lot, where every sound outside the car window had once made my heart race, but an easy quiet, the kind that belongs to a person who is, for the first time in longer than she can remember, entirely safe. I got up, made coffee in a kitchen that belonged to no one but me, and sat in the sunroom watching the light move across the floor, and I cried. Not from grief this time, though grief for Daniel never leaves entirely, but from something closer to relief, the kind that arrives only after you have spent a very long time bracing for a blow that has finally stopped coming. The accounting request landed on Vanessa's attorney's desk on a Thursday. By Pemberton's account, her attorney called him within the hour, confused, asking why Daniel's mother, a woman they believed to be destitute, possibly even homeless, based on what Vanessa herself had apparently told them, was suddenly filing formal legal requests with the full weight of professional representation behind her. Pemberton, ever composed, told them only that his client wished to ensure the estate was handled with complete transparency and in full accordance with the law. He did not mention the trust. He did not mention the $10 million. He let them sit in their confusion the way you let bread rise, slowly, in the dark, until it's ready. I called the family meeting myself. Not at the house. I would not give Vanessa the comfort of her own territory. But at Pemberton's office, the same mahogany table where I had first learned the truth about what my son had done for me. I invited Vanessa formally, through her attorney, citing the accounting matter. I invited Harold, who would not have missed it for anything in the world. And, because I believed she deserved the chance to hear the truth in a room full of witnesses rather than secondhand through lawyers, I invited Daniel's younger sister-in-law, Claire. Vanessa's own sister, a kind, soft-spoken woman who had always treated me with a warmth Vanessa never managed, and who I suspected, correctly, would not be able to stay silent once she understood what her sister had. Done. Vanessa arrived in a charcoal blazer, composed, slightly irritated, clearly expecting a tedious bureaucratic formality she could dispatch in 20 minutes and forget by lunch. She did not expect to see me sitting calmly at the head of the table, dressed simply, my hands folded, looking nothing at all like the desperate, needy, dramatic woman she had described at that memorial gathering. "Eleanor," she said, recovering quickly, sliding into the chair across from me with practiced composure. "I didn't realize you'd be here personally. I assumed this was just a clerical matter your attorney was handling." "It is my attorney handling it," I said. "But some conversations, I find, are better had in person. Don't you agree, Vanessa? You always did believe in saying things directly. Don't be dramatic. Pack your bags and learn to survive." I believe those were close to your exact words to me 3 weeks after I buried my son. The room went very quiet. I watched something flicker behind Vanessa's eyes. Not yet fear, not yet, but the first faint recognition that she had walked into a room she did not control. "That's not fair," she said, her voice tightening. I was grieving too. We both said things. I never said a single thing to you. I told her, my voice even, calm. The voice I had used for 31 years to soothe a frightened child now turned to an entirely different purpose. I packed my bags exactly as instructed. I learned to survive exactly as instructed. I slept in my car for 1 month, Vanessa, in a Walmart parking lot in April, with my knees aching and my son's photograph on the passenger seat because that was the only place you left for me to put it. I want you to sit with that fact for a moment before we continue, because I have been sitting with it for a great deal longer than a moment. Claire, beside her sister, had gone pale. Vanessa, she said quietly, is that true? You let her live in her car? Claire, beside her sister, had gone pale. Vanessa, she said quietly, is that true? You let her live in her car? Vanessa's eyes flicked toward her sister, and for just a moment, I saw something close to panic cross her face. Not guilt, not yet, but the dawning awareness that the audience in this room was not entirely hers to control the way the guests at that memorial gathering had been. Claire, it's complicated, she said, her voice tightening further. Eleanor had options. She chose to be difficult about the timeline. She slept in a parking lot, Claire said, and her voice had gone very quiet, very flat, the voice of someone doing arithmetic she did not want to do. For a month, while you were listing the house early and meeting up with Trent. She said the name without meaning to, I think. It had simply been sitting in the back of her mind, something she'd half noticed and half dismissed for months, and hearing the surname Lawlerland in that room a moment earlier had apparently jarred it loose. Vanessa's head snapped toward her sister. How do you know about Trent? Vanessa said, and the careful polish in her voice had cracked entirely now, revealing something underneath that was neither composed nor sympathetic. I didn't, not really, not until just now, Claire said, and I watched her own composure beginning to fray, watched a sister realizing in real time that she had spent the last several months making excuses for someone who did not deserve them. I saw a text on your phone once, at Mom's birthday, and you told me it was nothing. You told me I was being paranoid. I believed you, Vanessa. I defended you to Mom when she said something felt off about how fast you moved on this house. Vanessa did not deny it. She did not say anything at all for a long moment, and in the silence that followed, I watched a marriage's worth of small lies finish collapsing in front of 3 witnesses and a folder of documents that did not care, in the slightest, about anyone's feelings. Vanessa did not answer her sister. She looked instead at Pemberton, then at the folder in front of him, then back at me, and I watched the calculation happening behind her eyes. The same calculation, I imagine, she had run 100 times since the funeral, except now the numbers weren't adding up the way she expected. What is this about? Exactly, she said, and for the first time, her voice had lost its polish. It's about an accounting discrepancy, Pemberton said, sliding a document across the table. The house was listed in your probate filing at $410,000. The pre-market buyer you've already engaged, through a firm connected to a Mr. Trent Lawler, I believe, has agreed to purchase it for $690,000. That's a significant undervaluation in a sworn legal filing, Mrs. Whitfield. I'm sure there's an innocent explanation. I watched the color drain from Vanessa's face as Claire turned to stare at her, as the name Trent Lawler landed in that room like a stone dropped into still water. I did not need to say another word about the back patio, about the conversation I had overheard, about the laughter in her voice when she said she would soon be free. Claire's face had already told me she understood enough. And as for the rest, I continued, my voice steady. I think it's time you understood something else, Vanessa. Daniel didn't leave me with nothing. He never intended to. 18 months before he died, my son set aside $10 million in an irrevocable trust, in my name alone, specifically because he was afraid of exactly what you would do if anything ever happened to him. He knew you, Vanessa. He knew you better than any of us gave him credit for. And he made sure that no matter what you tried to take from me, you would never be able to touch the one thing that mattered most, my ability to survive without you. Vanessa's attorney, a sharp-faced man named Mr. Doyle, who had said almost nothing until that moment, leaned forward and asked, with the brittle composure of someone realizing too late that he had walked into the wrong fight, whether the trust documents could withstand a challenge. Pemberton did not even open the folder in front of him. 18 months of correspondence, Mr. Doyle, he said, psychiatric evaluation confirming sound mind, 2 independent witnesses, and a notarized letter your client's own husband wrote explaining his reasoning in his own words. I would not recommend spending Mrs. Whitfield's remaining estate funds attempting to contest it. Doyle said nothing further. He simply closed his own folder, the gesture of a man conceding a battle before it had properly begun. I will not pretend the silence that followed was comfortable for anyone in that room. Vanessa's hands had gone still on the table, her composure entirely gone, replaced by something raw, something closer to the truth of who she actually was underneath all that careful polish. "That's not possible," she said, barely above a whisper. "He never said anything. He never. He didn't tell you," I said, because he loved his mother more than he trusted his wife to be kind to her. That is not a thing I take pleasure in saying, Vanessa. I wish, more than anything, that it weren't true. I wish you had simply been the daughter-in-law I tried so hard to love. But you weren't. And now you have to live with the fact that the man you married saw exactly who you were, long before any of the rest of us did. The reckoning, once it began, did not resolve itself the way Vanessa wanted. Her own sister, Claire, left that office before the meeting had fully concluded, unable, she said through tears, to sit across from someone who had let an elderly widow sleep in a parking lot for a month while concealing a real estate scheme with a man who was, by every appearance, more than just an old friend. Claire and Vanessa did not speak again for the better part of a year, and when they finally did, it was Claire who called me first, quietly, to apologize for not seeing sooner what her sister had become. Vanessa, for her part, did not break cleanly. People rarely do. She tried, in the weeks that followed, several different versions of herself. First, wounded innocence, calling Pemberton's office, insisting the undervaluation was a clerical error made by an overworked junior associate. Then anger, hiring a more aggressive attorney who threatened to contest the trust, a threat that evaporated the moment Pemberton produced 18 months of carefully documented correspondence proving Daniel's clear, sound-minded intent. Then, finally, something quieter, something almost resembling shame, in a single voicemail she left me 2 months later that I have never returned and do not intend to. There was a brief, strange period, perhaps 6 weeks after the meeting at Pemberton's office, when Vanessa attempted a kind of public rehabilitation. A lengthy post on social media about grief, growth, and grace, carefully worded to suggest, without ever quite saying so, that she had simply made understandable mistakes during an impossibly difficult time. Claire showed it to me, more out of disbelief than malice, and asked what I made of it. I told her the truth, that I had no interest in correcting Vanessa's version of events for an audience of strangers, because the people who mattered already knew what had actually happened, and the people who didn't matter were welcome to believe whatever made them comfortable. Dignity, I have learned, does not require an audience to remain true. Claire and I grew closer in the months that followed, in a way I never expected and certainly never engineered. She began calling me every other Sunday, just to talk, sometimes about nothing in particular. A recipe she was trying, a book she was reading, the small, ordinary texture of a life being lived without performance. She told me once, over coffee at my new kitchen table, that she had spent years quietly explaining away her sister's coldness to other people, telling herself that Vanessa simply wasn't a warm person, rather than admitting what she had slowly come to suspect. That warmth was not a personality trait Vanessa lacked, but a resource she rationed carefully, spent only where it bought her something in return. I should have seen it sooner, Claire told me. I'm sorry I didn't. I told her there was nothing to apologize for. Sisters extend each other grace long after strangers would have stopped, and there is no shame in that, only love stretched, sometimes further than it should have been. She did not lose everything. I want to be honest with you, because this is not a story about destroying a woman. It is a story about a woman finally protecting herself. Vanessa kept her portion of the marital estate, reduced by the corrected valuation and by the legal costs of her own undoing, and the affair with Trent Lawler, once exposed within their small social circle, cost her a great deal more in reputation than I ever could have cost her in court. She moved out of state within the year. I have not heard from her since, and I find, to my own quiet surprise, that I do not need to. I think often about what wisdom I would offer another woman sitting where I once sat. in a parking lot, in the cold, certain that the worst thing that could happen to her had already happened. I would tell her this. Grief and powerlessness are not the same thing, even when they arrive together, even when the people who hurt you want you to believe they are. The people who underestimate you are not always wrong because you are secretly powerful in some dramatic, hidden way. Sometimes they are wrong simply because they have never bothered to ask what you are capable of, because asking would require seeing you as a full person rather than a convenience to be managed. I would also tell her this. Dignity is not loud. It does not need to announce itself in the moment it is being denied. It can wait, patient and quiet, in the front seat of a Corolla in a Walmart parking lot, and it will still be there, fully intact, when the moment finally comes to stand back up. My son knew that about me, even when I had forgotten it about myself. He built a trust no one could touch, not because he doubted my strength, but because he understood that even the strongest women deserve, sometimes, to be protected rather than tested. And I would tell her one more thing, perhaps the most important of all. Do not let the people who fail you write the final chapter of your story. Vanessa spent a great deal of energy trying to convince the people around her that I was needy, dramatic, a burden to be managed, and eventually discarded. For a few terrible weeks in a parking lot, I will admit, some small, exhausted part of me almost believed her. But the truth was always waiting for me at the end of that month, the way truth tends to wait for those patient enough to outlast the lie. I was never the woman she described. I was simply a woman whose strength had not yet been tested in front of the right audience. I live now in my small house with the sunroom, 11 minutes from Harold, who still sends me Christmas cards, even though we now see each other most weeks for coffee, and who I suspect, though neither of us has said it aloud, has become something more than an old friend to me in this last chapter of my life. He brought me a tomato plant the week I moved in, set it on the back porch without ceremony, and said only, "Every garden needs a start, Eleanor." I have thought about that sentence more than I probably should admit. I think it applies to more than tomatoes. I planted a full garden this spring, the first I have had time to tend since Daniel was small. Tomatoes, yes, but also basil, and a stubborn little row of zinnias that came up crooked but bloomed anyway. Bright orange against the fence, the same color as the marigolds Robert used to plant when Daniel was a baby. I think of my son every single day, not with the bitterness of those last weeks, but with the warmth of 31 years that came before them. The gap-toothed boy in the Little League uniform, the boy who saved for 8 months for a primer gray Civic, the engineer who built bridges, the son who loved his mother enough to protect her even from beyond the grave. I visit his grave every Sunday after church, and I tell him, out loud, the way I have always talked to him, about the garden, about Harold, about the small, steady life I have built out of what he left behind. I do not know if he can hear me. I choose to believe he can, because believing it costs me nothing and gives me everything. Sometimes, sitting there on the cool grass with my hand resting on the granite marker that bears his name, I think about the boy who saved for 8 months for a battered Civic, rather than ask his mother for money she didn't have, and I understand, finally, completely, why he chose to protect me the way he did. He had spent his whole life refusing to be a burden to anyone, and in his last act of love, he made absolutely certain that I would never have to be one either. That is the inheritance that matters most to me. Not the $10 million, though I will not pretend that figure hasn't changed my life in every practical sense, but the knowledge, carried in my chest like a small, steady flame, that my son saw me clearly, loved me completely, and made sure that whatever happened to him, I would land somewhere soft. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? And from where in the world are you listening? I read every message, and you mean more to me than you know. For more stories like this one, like this video, and subscribe. There is so much more waiting for you. With love and respect. Until next time.